Hello and welcome to the IRDR Humanitarian Summit. Doing even more for even less. I'm sure none of us are personally thinking about that at the moment in the current climate, but particularly in the humanitarian sector, how are we going to do this? How can we ensure we're doing things in the best way? How can we check we're doing things in the best way? And how can we inspire future minds to do things even better than how we are doing things at the moment? I want to welcome everybody here to UCL and in particular to the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here, whether you are joining us in the room or online as well. And we're absolutely delighted to host today. I want to say a particular thanks to Dr. Lisa Guppy, our lecturer in Global Humanitarian Studies, for putting on today and collecting it and convening it. She will be introducing the program in just a moment, but I'd like to say a huge thanks to Lisa in advance for putting it all together. So thank you, Lisa. At the IRDR, we have the BSc Global Humanitarian Studies. So what I've just said about trying to get future minds do things even better, that's exactly what we're trying to do. And for those of you in the room who are on our programs, we do have high expectations of you. We are expecting you to answer this problem in the future. I am expecting to see your names and your pictures to have just solved it, to have solved everything at some point in the future. You've got some time, it doesn't have to be tomorrow, but that is the expectations we have of you. And I really do hope you go on and do amazing things. I want to also just reflect a little bit on the last year in our department, the IRDR, the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction, because we are growing. We are growing fast, and I think that's a real reflection on just how important these issues are, particularly in the humanitarian sector and disaster risk reduction. Some of our new staff include our Associate Professor in International Relations, Dr. Philip Cunliffe, our Professor of Risk and Disaster Reduction, Mark Pelling, our Professor in Geophysical Hazard Risks, Fatima Jalea, our Lecturer in Disaster and Crisis Risk Finance, Stefan Liefers, 2 Associate Lecture Teachings in Risk, Disaster and Humanitarianism, Miles Harris and Caroline Russell, and we're soon to be joined by 2 more in the beginning of July. They just missed getting in there before these conferences. Our lecturer in Risk Perception and Communications, Sarah Dryhurst, and our lecturer in Disaster and Crisis Response, Dan Haynes. Thinking about these topics, what are these themes? What are these ideas? How do they come together and how are they going to address this problem of doing even more for even less? At that point, as I say, welcome, and I'd like to hand over to Lisa. And again, thank you, not just to Lisa, but to all those helping today, those behind the scenes, those at the front, sharing sessions, particularly our speakers and our guests. Thank you for coming, and I really look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joey. I really appreciate that warm welcome. And I'm going to be doing the administrative bit now, hopefully successfully. I'm going to just show here the agenda for today. And I'm only going to be speaking for a few minutes, and then we're going to move straight into our keynote. But I did want to start with the important housekeeping first. There are toilets on the ground floor in the foyer, and there's also a water fountain there if you need to fill up your bottle. In case of fire, there's a fire exit at the back, and I guess to the front. And if the fire alarm goes off, we haven't been told there's any drills, so it will be a real fire alarm. So please do exit, and you will be guided out by fire wardens. The Wi-Fi is available if you haven't found UCL Guest yet. It doesn't require a password. And so finally, we're all here. Thank you so much for joining in person and online. The topic that we're discussing today is essentially very simple. As our keynote speaker, Claudia, is going to highlight, the world has an estimated 404 million people at humanitarian levels of need in 2023, and a record shortfall of around $55 billion in required funding. So these statistics are simple to present, but of course the problem is extremely difficult to change. And as a kind of day-to-day plug, we have humanitarians being exhorted for many years to do more with less. And so we have the theme of today, are we doing even more for even less, and where does that end and how far can it go? So today our speakers and guests are going to address this problem from many different perspectives. As you know, well, as I hope you will understand by the end of the day, we're a very multidisciplinary institute, so we're going to have lots of different perspectives. So first we're going to have a keynote by Claudia Wells, who I'll introduce in a moment. Then we'll have the first of two video interventions. Leon Chammah is joining us from Beirut, we hope, if the electricity is up and the connection is fine. Leon is a very experienced program manager from UNICEF, who will talk about his work in Darfur, which is in Western Sudan. At 11 a.m., Dr. Estella Guppy is here, and she will be facilitating a panel of 4 experts who will discuss today's practices and policies around doing even more for even less. And the panel will present different perspectives from academic research, but also from the world of practitioner and advocacy. We'll have a break at 12:15, and you're welcome to head off and find lunch. If you're new to this area of London, you can stop at the registration desk outside and you'll get some advice, but there's a cafe literally at the front of the building, so hopefully you'll be fine. And please do be back promptly at 1:45, because we're going to start with a really interesting video from Thomas, who is the Assistant Director for CARE International in Turkey, and he's going to speak about the current situation in northwest Syria. So after that, we're going to have a wrap-up discussion led by Professor David Alexander. We're going to have one person again zooming in and 2 experts here with David in person as well, and we'll be introducing them later. But I think the discussion is going to be a really fascinating way to wrap up the day and reflect on the discussions that we've had, as well as advancing new perspectives, particularly from the UK, as David Alexander has been involved in the current review that is ongoing from the COVID-19 pandemic and the government's handling of that. So we're going to close around 3:30 so that we can all talk around tea and coffee, and everyone is invited for that. And I think that is our day. So let me launch into a very brief introduction to Claudia Wells. Now, the profiles of all of our speakers and guests are online, so we're not going to go through them in detail so much today. But just briefly, Claudia leads the development and implementation of development initiatives strategy at the international level. And development initiatives is based in Bristol, and put out the annual report on global humanitarian assistance. And we're very lucky to have timed this summit so that it was launched. The flagship report was launched yesterday. So all of these statistics are hot off the press. And Claudia directs DI's, Development International's major programs and projects, and has over 20 years experience of developing new statistics and communicating evidence at national and international levels. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Claudia to come up on stage.
Thank you so much, everyone. Such a lovely warm welcome. Thank you especially to Lisa for inviting us to be here today. It's a real pleasure to be here at UCL. Do I need to be mic'd up? Yes. Oh, apologies. Right. Is that okay? Okay. A real pleasure to be here today with colleagues who are so passionate about the need for data and evidence to inform decisions in this area. And it's something that's very close to my heart personally. So my name is Claudia Wells. I'm the director, the International Hub Director at Development Initiatives. We're an organization that works globally on providing data and evidence to inform decisions that reduce poverty, reduce inequality, and increase resilience. We've been working in the humanitarian area for over 20 years and actually publishing this global humanitarian assistance report for over 20 years. But before I start, I want to fess up here that I am not a humanitarian or development expert, actually. I'm a data person. So be kind to me, but my passion is the importance of having this data and evidence to ensure that we are holding people accountable, to ensure that the right decisions are being made, and to ensure that those who are most vulnerable and most marginalized are being targeted effectively, so we improve lives. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm a sort of official statistician by background, and so you will see me highlighting various data problems as I go through the latest figures. And I just think that that is really, really vital. We've got to improve the data sources in some of these areas if we're going to ensure that we hold our governments and our leaders to account to deliver on the commitments that they've made and hopefully improve those commitments as well. So this presentation is going to cover the key trends and findings from our most recent report. Like Lisa said, hot off the press yesterday, and like I said, I'm standing on the heads and shoulders of my fantastic team who've been working really, really hard over the past few months to get this data and evidence ready for you. We're going to look at the latest trends in international assistance, the latest evidence on what the need is, who's providing it, where it's going, and how it's being delivered, and what other resources beyond humanitarian assistance are reaching countries in humanitarian crisis. We recognize that humanitarian assistance is just one of the financial flows that reaches the people in need in these countries, and we need to look at a holistic picture of that. So without further ado, let's have a little bit of an exploration in what is the level of need on to. So this slide here shows the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance over the last 10 years. And we're looking here at a significant growth in the number of people in need. It's certainly doubled over the past 5 years, as you can see, and it's almost likely to be more than 4 times higher than it was 10 years ago. But here is an important data point. Those figures from 2013 to 2017 are almost certainly an underestimate because we have incomplete data there, which is why I'm not giving you that overall 10-year figure. But it means that as we stand here today, okay, apologies, thank you very much. We've seen a recent growth. So in 2022, we've got over 406 million people in need. That's nearly 6 times the population here in the UK. And if you look at the preliminary figures that we've got for 2023, they're almost as high. So they're almost certainly going to be higher for this year. So it's clear that the number of people in need have increased, but what are the primary drivers? And when we dig into the details of the data, there is an increasing complexity of need. We're looking at intersecting socioeconomic factors of vulnerability, conflict, and accelerating climate change. So 58% of those identified as in need of humanitarian assistance live in countries that are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, 58%. 3/4, so 75% of all of those people in need have faced at least 2 risk factors. So at least one of experiencing conflict, high climate vulnerability, or socioeconomic vulnerability. And 83% were located in countries experiencing protracted crisis. So we have an increasing need, an increasing complexity of need that is absolutely multidimensional, and an increasing amount of those people living in countries that are in protracted crisis, so have been experiencing crisis for 5 or more years. So let's have a little look at the targeting figures. So if that's the need, how are people being targeted? So we've used data from UN coordinated appeals for this to estimate it. And it gives us a sense of the scale of the international humanitarian response. as they draw together actors, funding and programs in contexts where large-scale humanitarian crisis is happening. Now, the data is not perfect here. Appeals don't exist in all countries, but it does cover a significant share of the international assistance, but they don't cover all international actors or certainly all funding. So this is kind of giving us a flavor of this targeting. So what do we see from the UN appeal data? The system is targeting more people. So you can see the number of appeals, though, which is the line chart on the other side, is actually dropping. So while the system is targeting more people recently, the number of appeals is dropping, which means there is a growing concentration because there are probably fewer countries overall in need. Behind this concentration, there is a growing number, like I said earlier, of protracted crisis, with 83% of people living in countries with UN appeals for 5 or more consecutive years. And from this, we can see that humanitarian assistance is not, as it was originally designed, facilitating or helping one-off short-term emergencies, but long-term, often recurrent, often cyclical, protracted crises. And the impacts of both the growing cost of response as new crises emerge, but relatively few end, and the nature of how responses are and should be structured and financed, it really makes you question that. So we're going to look a little bit more at some of those drivers. I've mentioned conflict, climate, and socioeconomic vulnerability, but we know that food insecurity is increasingly being one of the most prominent factors in rising levels of humanitarian need. So this chart looks at 2 different things, actually. It looks at the number of people who are experiencing food insecurity, but we've also created a methodology that looks at the depth of that food insecurity as well. And we think it's really important that you look at both, not just the numbers, but the depth of that food insecurity. So in 2022-23, there was an estimated 265.7 million people facing crisis levels of acute food insecurity across 60 countries. For a bit of scale, that figure is representative of about 4 times the amount of people who live here in the UK experiencing crisis levels of food insecurity. There's been an 8% increase since 2021, and over double the number of people facing food insecurity before the COVID-19 pandemic. So our metric here, which is designed both to measure the number of people in food insecurity in a country, and that's the size of the bubble that you see on this screen, but also the index on the side, we look at the severity of acute food insecurity. And this slide demonstrates why it's really important to look at both these 2 factors. So if you look at the first country represented in Somalia, you can see that the severity of acute food insecurity has gone up between 2017 and 2023, and the number of people experiencing food insecurity has also grown. But this isn't always true. If you look at a country like Pakistan, actually the depth of acute food insecurity has reduced, but the number of people experiencing food insecurity has increased. And this is a really vital depth in your data to understand and inform the response that might be needed in these countries. And we've added in Ukraine here. We know that this is a huge issue at the moment. We've got no data from 2018, but you can see that there are a significant number of people experiencing food insecurity there as well. So we've looked a little bit at the need, the targeting, and delved a little bit into food insecurity. And now I want to have a little look at how much humanitarian assistance actually is there to meet some of these needs, and how have those volumes changed over time. And so this is our first slide on this. It's showing overarching humanitarian assistance since 2018. And so you have seen that international humanitarian assistance has grown markedly in 2022. And so this unprecedented increase in needs was met by an unprecedented response. But I think what's striking to me about this chart is how similar the bars are from 2018 to 2021. We were seeing an increasing need across those years, but the response remained fairly stagnant, actually. So I think there is a huge question here about whether this unprecedented response can be maintained as we are predicting that need is still going to increase. Interestingly, we've done some work here at DI on private funding. And the data shows that this tends to mirror the proportions that we see in public funding. Is there an opportunity to alter some of these patterns? And we expect that the Ukraine crisis will significantly alter patterns around private funders and donors. So if we delve into this a little bit more and have a look at who's providing that assistance. Again, nearly all of the top 10 donors increased their contributions in 2022. So that's that evidence of that unprecedented response. But I think what's important to note is that this table of top 10, and if you look at the top 20 donors, this doesn't change over time. There's been really no change. And the majority of these public donors continue to be the ones who provide the majority of international humanitarian assistance. Overall funding is static. Relatively small numbers of donors give nearly all of the assistance. So that top 20 covers 97% of all funding. And funding is actually very, very concentrated in the top 3 funders that you see here, the US, Germany, and the EU. They provide about 64% of all humanitarian assistance, just those 3 funders alone. And the US accounts for nearly 40%, actually, 39%. And again, those patterns really haven't changed over time. So I think my question to you in the room is, what needs to change in order to meet this unprecedented need? So we're going to now have a little look at how the volumes provided relate to need. With what we've seen of volumes of assistance and to what extent this assistance is currently covering identified need. And again, UN coordinated appeals give us the best, if not perfect, proxy for assessing this. So this slide shows the funding to appeals, and it shows it rising, but it also shows a growth in requirements. That means actually that white bar, the white portion of those that bar is pretty significant. So while the bottom shows the percentage of total requirements met is slowly creeping up over the last 3 years, but it's certainly not meeting the average of over 60% that we've seen over the past 10 years. It's still below 60%. When you look at the actual numbers of people whose requirements are unmet, that is growing. So if we move to where assistance is being targeted, and who were the largest recipients that we've seen in 2021 and 2022. So in 2022, perhaps unsurprisingly, Ukraine has received more international humanitarian assistance than any other country, which also received the largest volume ever received in 1 year by any country. So again, really unprecedented levels and unprecedented response there. The top 10 recipients of humanitarian assistance received 63% of all the total country allocatable funding. And that hasn't changed. That compares to about 64% over the last 10 years. So again, you get this picture of, yes, there's been an unprecedented response, but really there's not much change happening within the system. And as with the donors, it's a really static picture. The largest recipients of humanitarian assistance, so those 13 countries, have featured in the top 10 recipients of international humanitarian assistance over the last 5 years, and 7 countries. So that will be South Sudan, Somalia, Syria, Lebanon, Ethiopia, Yemen, DRC. They've consistently remained in the top recipients over the last 5 years. They're experiencing protracted crisis, and in fact, countries experiencing protracted crisis received about 92% of all funding. There is a wider picture here, if we look at the rest of the table, and that's about sort of 95 countries receiving funding of more than about 5 million, but still that top 10 remains very, very similar. So when we dig into and look at the recipient country data and where that funding is coming from in terms of donors, we have a look at what we call sort of donor preferences. So the share of funding provided by donors, and that often varies between crisis and between country. And so this slide shows the largest 3 recipients. So Ukraine, Afghanistan, and Yemen, and then their share of assistance that each country receives, and what proportion of that is provided by each of the individual donors. So as you might expect here, the US is providing the biggest proportion across all of these 3 countries, between 1/3 and 35% of the funding is coming from the US. And as the top donor, you'd expect that. And actually the largest 3 donors, so including Germany and the EU, you can see that they are also featuring here in the top donors. But there are some notable cases where donors appear to be accounting for a significantly greater share of the funding to these crises, that is slightly inconsistent with how much funding that they're providing overall. And notable here is the UK being the 2nd largest funder to Afghanistan, and Saudi Arabia being the 2nd largest funder to Yemen. So some differences in there coming out. But it's not just about the volumes, it's about how that assistance is being channeled, as I'm sure you all know, and is it being provided effectively and efficiently? So we've tried to have a look at this. This is one of my favorite diagrams, but you probably need to look at it on a slightly bigger screen. So we've got first level recipient organizations here, and you can see that multilateral organizations are taking a much greater share of that first level recipient. And then what we've tried to do is track that to see where it's going. And you can see it's really, really difficult to do. And I think the most important thing about this slide for me as a data person is that we have a really huge unknown content there on the right side of the chart. So yeah, we know where it's going to initially, but where is the majority of that funding going after that? And with commitments towards localization and local and national actors, how can we be holding our commitment makers to account and understanding what's happening and what's effective if we're not tracking this funding all the way through the system towards implementation? The other striking thing about this is if we were to produce this chart several years ago, it would look exactly the same. So again, that pattern of actually underlying the system isn't really changing comes through on this. And from what we can tell, local and national actors where we do have data, and I'll dig into this in a bit more detail now, receive very, very little amounts of the funding. So let's have a look and see what I can tell you about direct funding to local and national actors, because I know that this is a really critical issue. So the first point is really, we have terrible data on this because we've only got good data for first recipients and not for subsequent secondary and following recipients from that. It's really difficult. So where we do have data though, we're going to give you a flavour of what's happening. And this is showing direct funding to local and national actors remaining at a really small share of total assistance. So if you look, the dotted line on the line chart here is showing the direct and trackable indirect funding. So that accounts for both the first part of the funding and then the second part. And you can see that actually, despite commitments, this figure is going down based on the available data that we've got. It's gone from 4.1% of all funding in 2020 down to 2.1 in 2022. Of that 2.1%, only 1.2% of funding goes directly to local and national actors. So while this data isn't complete, there is no way that we are anywhere near meeting the targets of 25% of funding being funneled to these actors at the moment. And something needs to significantly change if we're going to hold ourselves to those commitments. The charts on the bar charts on the right gives you a little bit more detail and breakdown about where that is going. Is it going to national governments? Is it going to local and national NGOs? Or is it going to national societies? And here you can see a varying picture, but most of the funding goes to local and national NGOs and not national governments, and very, very small amounts going to national societies. If we look, go on to look at the pooled funds, because when you look at pooled funds, this is where we know that actually they're increasingly seen as an effective mechanism to channel more funding to local and national actors. And they also set a really high standard of transparency. So importantly, they've got data that we can look at. And they provide close to near real-time data on allocations and subgrants, which is great. And this chart shows the recipients of allocations from 2 OCHA-managed pooled funds, the country-based pooled funds, which is the sort of second bar in each year, and the Central Emergency Response Fund, which is the first bar in each year, but the first recipient of that fund is always a UN agency. So you can see that that proportion is all going to UN agencies, and then the country-based pooled funds, that is split across UN agencies, international NGOs, local and national NGOs, and a more local response. So you can see, actually, looking at these pooled funds, over time, you can pretty much see a year-on-year steady increase, which is great. But it's still only a really small proportion. So even in 2022, the total amount of funding is only 1.9 billion across both of those funds. The country-based pooled funds allocated over a quarter of their funding to local and national actors. 36% of those included subgrant data. And in 2021, we've got some preliminary data from the emergency response funds, and it's indicating that about 18% of those allocations were subgranted to local and national actors. So while this fund is looking better, it's still not indicating that we're reaching the quarter 25% targets that are so often talked about. I'm going to have a little look at this proportion data. So that just shows that the slight increase that I was talking about within these funds, which is a good indication. But I guess the question that I would ask of all of you is, are those lines going up quickly enough? And what does that mean for our local response that you know is much more effective and efficient? Looking a little bit more at some of the specific responses, we've pulled out information here on cash and voucher assistance, reform efforts to increase efficiency, but also empower recipients of humanitarian assistance have called for more assistance in the form of cash and vouchers. The data here isn't well reported publicly, so it's an area where we as an organisation independently collate data from implementing agencies. But you can see consistent growth over the years. And that's continued into 2022. So cash programming has increased from just over 3 billion to nearly 8 billion in 2022. And it accounts for around 20% of the total humanitarian assistance. So that's great. We're seeing that increase. We've seen a greater increase in 2022, but is that due to the unprecedented response that we've seen, and can that be maintained? And 20% is great, but it's still well below the target of between 30 and 50% of assistance being delivered through this mechanism. So again, questions around whether we're really targeting funding as efficiently as we could. So it's really important that we look beyond humanitarian assistance, though. You will know that humanitarian assistance was designed as a response to acute crisis and not to address the underlying drivers and causes of crises themselves. And humanitarian assistance is increasingly deployed in contexts, like I said before, that are protracted. It's being asked to do more for longer. And some would argue being asked to do the work that other streams of finance should be doing. But if countries are to emerge from crisis, rather than being stuck either in recurrent or cycles of crisis, we need to look at these underlying causes and drivers and look at the financing that's helping those mechanisms as well. And in some cases, conditions like food security and climate just cycle in on themselves, being both drivers and results of crisis. So you can't look at these things in isolation, and they're all very context specific. So how do we look at the kind of role of development finance alongside peace building finance and alongside development assistance? And how do we look at these streams together? And this chart is showing you those streams and proportions of total overseas development assistance that has been provided as development assistance. That's the top line at the top in darker purple. And you can see as that has dropped in 2021, we've seen an increase in the amount of humanitarian assistance. And I found it quite striking, actually, how closely those line patterns really track each other. And it really does look like one stream is being played off against the other, where one increases, the other decreases, and vice versa. And is that the kind of system that we need to see when we're addressing protracted crises? And you see a fairly stable, but actually potentially reducing amount going to peace assistance here. And this is important because we need to look at Nexus. It needs to look at all of these things and these specific mechanisms, and really understand the sort of transition points between these types of funding. So that was a bit of a reflection on the peace building, the development and humanitarian nexus. But we know that climate is increasingly becoming an issue, and there are accelerating impacts of climate change, and they really do form and must form part of this joined up conversation around the responses to countries experiencing crisis. And in practice, actually, the degree of join up of those conversations has been rather slight, in this regard is slight. And I think there are two questions here. In practice, what climate finance is reaching countries in crisis? And how is that finance, if at all, working in countries to mitigate or prevent crisis? And in all honesty, we can see some answers to the first question that I posed there, but the second one is really, really hard. There are lots of issues regarding data reporting and transparency issues. There's double counting with climate finance that really needs to be unpicked. And in particular, with regard to how much reaches communities and local actors, this is going to be a subject of ongoing and up and coming research. So not questions I'll be able to answer for you today, but this is what we can see. And there's some really interesting differences here. And if you look at the chart, we've broken it down into countries that are highly climate vulnerable and in a protracted crisis. So that's that small column on the left of the bar chart here, where you look at just over $1 per person being dispersed in countries that are highly climate vulnerable, but also experiencing protracted crisis. And if you look at that versus those that are highly climate vulnerable, but not in protracted crisis, that's the biggest column over there. And they're getting around nearly $5 per person dispersed. So there is a real issue there in terms of those experiencing protracted crisis, but also highly vulnerable, getting the least amount of climate finance and climate support. There's also an issue that's demonstrated on this slide. When you look at the bar chart, we've split it into approved and dispersed funds versus approved but not dispersed funds. And I think there's a critical issue here that actually our commitments being followed through on. And we're seeing a significant amount of funds that have been approved but are not reaching people yet on this slide. Finally, we know that international finance for disaster risk reduction is also a critical component in ensuring that development gains are preserved and the impacts of disaster are not worsened by vulnerability or compounded by existing crisis. When looking at the trends of disaster risk reduction finance, it shows that DRR may not be as effectively targeted to countries with the highest level of risk to natural disaster. We show flows here, which when summed over the regions total more than 20 million. And that indicates that where the strongest concentration in geographical relationships are really, and you can see here the US channeling funding to the Caribbean and South America, Japan channeling a huge amount of funding in this area, but very much focused on Asia. And then the European funders more focused in Africa. So it's really showing sort of more geographic donor preferences potentially here than targeted to where the funding most necessarily needs to go. So rather than being based on natural hazards, potentially geographic or historic preferences being shown, no consistent explanation really in the variance of disaster risk reduction finance. And I think Japan here is obviously a really striking donor in this space. It's rapidly increased its contributions for disaster risk reduction, almost fivefold between 2019 and 2021, with large volumes going to Indonesia, the Philippines, and Bangladesh. So what does this all mean? And where does that leave us today? So our Global Humanitarian Assistance Report, which you can download on our website, has a huge amount of more detailed analysis. It's complemented by a range of in-depth analysis reports that look at specific issues. You can access those. There's interactive charts and an underlying data set that we've released. But essentially, the report paints a picture of a system overwhelmed. And I think in need of significant change. So we have increasing need, increasingly complex need, and increasingly multidimensional need. Yes, there's been an unprecedented response in the recent year, but needs are continuing to increase. And can we maintain that unprecedented response with the current system? And I think that is a real huge question, and I would love to hear you discuss that later today. Especially striking, as I mentioned, is that there's actually little has changed when you unpick what's happening at the system level. We're looking at the same proportions, we're looking at the same funders going to the same countries. And can we really tweak this system to create the radical change that we need to really meet everyone's needs? And is it going to create that transformation needed? Are we making the most of funding? And I think there's early indications of good progress here. More funding is going to local and national actors. but we don't have the data here. It's a bit of a black hole. We can't hold our commitment makers to account on this at the moment. And certainly from the data that we do have, the indication is that that funding flow to local and national actors is below target and commitment at the moment. And then we need to look at the climate finance. There are huge increasing calls for climate finance. How can we leverage this to ensure that we're making humanitarian response most effective and that we're really getting to the people who need it most? Thank you very much.
So we have a couple of questions and answers. We are running a little bit behind time, but does anyone have anything that would like to? I wouldn't mind kicking off, actually.
Good.
I was really interested in the food security slide that you had, because you were showing not only population but severity. Can you go into that a little bit more as well, if we go back to that slide, and the importance of understanding severity when we're talking about food insecurity?
Oh, I'm not sure. The sharing of the screen has gone, but essentially you could see there both the number of people, but what's really important in a similarly way where you look at poverty is not just whether people are above or below a line, but how far below a line they are. Because the depth of food insecurity, and as well as the people experiencing that, really needs to inform the tailored response in these cases. And I think that that's really evident, the fact that it is so variable. You'll see increasing numbers in some cases experiencing food insecurity, but if they're just below one line or if they're very, very below the line, that really does mean a different kind of response in terms of how you'll get them to those people, how will you be lifting them above so that they are getting the basic services and access to the basic food that they need. And that is a much heavier lift if someone is in much more acute food insecurity than it is. And obviously, if there's a greater population, you need to think about where that population is and inform your response there. And so I think we really believe that you've got to look at those two measures, probably alongside a suite of others, to really tailor the response to the specific context in each of the countries and really how long that crisis has been happening for.
Thank you so much. And we have one more question here.
Thank you. You talked a lot about the gap in data and how many unknowns there are. I was just wondering, do you have any feel or sense of, is there this data gap because people aren't willing to share it? Is it that it's just so complicated? Is it that there are records somewhere, but they're not compatible and you can't access them? Or is it just there's no data? Do you have any sense of where we are on that at all?
So that's a complicated question. So we use a combination of data sources, including data that we collect ourselves at DI. So we do try and fill in those data gaps. But what you have is all of the kind of OECD DAC CRS data, kind of your really strong official source of data that's usually very complete, but it's not very timely. And you know, as you'll all know in here, for informing humanitarian response, actually timely data is really, really valuable. And that data is quite often sort of 2 years out of date by the time you're starting to look at it. So that's where we're augmenting it with FTS data. They don't always agree though, so there's lots of things that we need to do in our methodology to match those up and work out whether one source is potentially underreporting or more comprehensive than another. And we also look at the International Aid Transparency Initiative data, which has lots more information on how things are being dispersed as well. So I think there are a disparate number of sources of data that have differing levels of quality depending on what you're using, and it's a case of needing to bring those together so that you're creating a comprehensive picture of what's actually happening rather than looking at one data source. And I think that's really critical. You can't just look at one data source in these sections. You've got to look at the country context as well as these flows. And I think in some areas actually it is complicated, where we're trying to track through to local and national actors. It's really complicated and actually just not as consistently reported. So it's a combination of a complicated system, differing levels of quality and timeliness, and also real gaps where we're wanting to see them most, in particular on local implementation.
Thank you so much, Claudia. I think we'll have to leave it there.
Thank you.
I think that was a really fascinating discussion, and the Global Humanitarian Assistance Report is now available for 2023 download, so thank you so much. We are going to now move to Leon Chammah, who is online for us.
Good morning, everyone. I am Leon Chammah, Program Manager, working with UNICEF Sudan on strengthening the resilience and social cohesion of people in Darfur. What a pleasure to be with you today, participating on the yearly Humanitarian Summit organized by the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction at UCL. It is a great opportunity to be with you today to discuss and showcase how UNICEF is trying to do more with less, with a focus on a Sudan example. UNICEF has more than 75 years presence in Sudan, working with the most vulnerable children and communities and different stakeholders to improve the child well-being in Sudan. Since 2019, UNICEF Sudan started to move progressively its program from pure humanitarian towards mid and long-term development, addressing issues such as flood management, drought, and long-term displacement. All these issues are protracted elements in the history of Sudan. This is said, how UNICEF is trying to do more with less. This will be our discussion in the couple minutes coming. To do so, one important element is that UNICEF globally, and more specifically in Sudan, is adopting the humanitarian development and peace approach, what we call the HDP nexus. The humanitarian development peace is a way to shift progressively from humanitarian dependence to development approach with a focus on peace building. This move will take into consideration each context and community capacity and readiness for this transition. Let's discuss now how HDP allows UNICEF to do more with less. HDP focus on community ownership, which provides a space for community contribution and decision making, as cost sharing in the activities, provision by provision of land, human resources, or even explore localization, such using local materials that cost in general less. And we have a lot of examples that we can present where UNICEF had built infrastructure using new methods that last for long and by using local materials. The ATP approach also works with the community to understand the risk surrounding them and its impact and how to mitigate this risk in a way to reduce the impact on the communities. Examples of risk-informed activities are flood management to protect community infrastructure, and by doing this, we reduce the cost on the community, or by disease prevention through vaccination or better sanitation practices. It is also very important to consider sustainability, which is in general a development principle. Once we do this investment with the community ownership, an operational and management plan need to be adopted and put in place to sustain the service. In the investment, we consider durable solution as cost reduction, thus the use of solar energy for water pumping or water harvesting in drought areas, or even drip irrigation in agricultural practices. The operation and management plan is a very important aspect that the community need to understand in order to define the cost, but also to develop a system that do not leave anyone behind. This operational and management plan is a result of sustainability, and we have seen a lot of interventions where communities do not operate and maintain the facility and the service do not exist. Another aspect of how humanitarian and development peace nexus can contribute to do more with less is the integration of services in a more efficient way, where we can see education services with protection services, or we can see multi-purpose community centers that can serve different purposes. I would like to bring to our attention the social cohesion and peace building as an important mean also for how we can do more. This allows us to ensure that more communities will benefit from the service and there will be no barriers in place to provide the service for communities in an integrated way. And this can be really implemented through social cohesion. Through HDP approach, we expect to break the cycle of dependence from aid assistance by supporting people to gradually rely on themselves and move forward. I want, through your forum, to highlight that the humanitarian actors are working to adapt to the global needs, but there is still a huge gap that we need to continue supporting, especially when it comes to humanitarian assistance. Individuals and societies are called for to do more solidarity, especially when it comes to humanitarian needs. I would like to raise the voice that the recent crisis in Sudan has a huge impact on the children, huge needs that are not yet addressed and they require to be supported. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
And that was a really interesting voice from the field, we're calling that. That was about UNICEF's work in Sudan from a very experienced program manager, Leon. We have Leon here. I'm going to say live. Are there any questions for Leon? I have one, if it's okay, Leon. You outlined some really successful innovations that UNICEF are undertaking. I was just wondering, the last note that you said was that there are still lots of unmet needs. Can you mention some challenges that you've had in implementing the Nexus?
Yeah, I think I would like to link to what Mrs. Claudia was mentioning. We are really working in 95% of the countries that are affected are protracted crisis countries. And they are affected with a lot of aspects: climate change, conflict, and economic crisis. We see a lot of fatigue at the donors level. A lot of people are, and when we look, for example, the top are Syria, Afghanistan, Sudan. These countries are really, has been on the news for a long period of time. And this is why we feel like there is a necessity to move to more humanitarian and development approach. And I think the challenges are, if we want to list them, they are at different levels. We were talking, and we still in the presentation of see the funding stream coming either from humanitarian or development or peace. And we don't see, and this is, if we start from the donor side, this is, we still see this segregation, which is a little bit sometimes very difficult in how we can adapt our programming. And I just want to give the example of my current program. It was funded by the Development Fund, and now we are facing a crisis. How we can adapt? I think there is a lot of learning, and this is why I'm putting the HDP as a space for our discussion today, because this is very recent. And this is where we need to push more for advocacy at different levels. So this is one aspect. The second aspect, I think implementer levels, either agencies or UN agencies or NGOs. We are so sectoral. And this is why one of the challenges we were facing, and I mentioned it in my presentation, how we can be cross-cutting, how we can leverage resources. When we build a school, how the school can be more useful, not only for education, but for child protection, water, or even livelihood. I didn't mention in my presentation that our program is also a joint program with WFP. So we are coming to a community doing an integrated approach. And this is not easy. Two agencies working together is more difficult and take more time. So all these aspects are very important. What is a good note that I wanted to bring is a lot of time we're surprised by the community readiness to phase out from dependence and their readiness to cost share and contribute and to look to systems that are different. And I can talk about some sustainable development plans or ideas that came from the communities. People don't want to rely on aid or assistance or even on government aid. And we have discussed some sustainability system by cost sharing, but also paying as they go for their services. So pay for their water to ensure that the water continue to be implemented. We have seen some examples also of community pharmacies where a solidarity system is coming in place and the community decide how to leverage the aid or the assistance of medicines that come and how people can pay, others can pay less. So there is a lot of examples, but this is still at early stage. Our program was looking to a lot of learning. And I think this is a very interesting model that might be a way to look how we can do more in this protracted crisis. The last level of challenges, I think, is peace. And I feel like this is what we are facing right now. In these protracted crisis countries, it has been mentioned by Mrs. Claudia that it is a cycle of crisis. So how we can adapt when the crisis goes up and go down to ensure that assistance and resilience is being addressed. So I think this is currently our main challenge, and this is where I look to brainstorm how our program can adapt in a conflict where we were thinking that it will be more for midterm interventions.
Well, thank you so much, Leon. We really appreciate this intervention, and I really wish you good luck with the work in Sudan, because I'm sure it's extremely difficult at the moment.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me with you, and have a good follow-up day.
Thank you so much, Leon. Oh, and now we'll bring up, I think, the panel discussions. So I'm sorry everybody's morning tea, or sorry, lunchtime may be delayed by about 10 minutes, but I'd like to welcome Dr. Lisa Guppy up to open the panel and begin our final session of the morning.
Thanks. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Stella Carpi. I'm a lecturer in Humanitarian Studies in the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction at UCL. Just a second, sorry, I'm unfamiliar with these because I normally speak quite loud. Okay. So I'm really thrilled to chair this panel today. We will have 4 experts discussing today's practices and policies around doing even more with even less. That is per se a challenging topic, I would say. So as Lisa mentioned, we hear perspectives from academic research, but also from the world of practitioners and advocacy. Indeed, I think like this is really an opportunity to reflect together on these standard discourse that we are all exposed to on budget shortfalls, chronic budget shortfalls, I would say, and increasingly greater humanitarian needs, especially in situations of prolonged instability and violence, as we have seen today, like the case of Sudan is quite a case in point, I would say. That's a case in point. So typically, the farther we go from the beginning of the crisis, the less gets invested in aid in specific regions. So is it really about lacking financial resources, or is it about thinking of a different politics of how to address this cycle of crises, as Claudia Wells was mentioning earlier in her insightful talk? So I really look forward to hearing our speakers' views and analysis. I now have the pleasure to invite Dr. Mohammed Salihin here, who will go first. So let me introduce Salihin a little bit more. Dr. Salihin is an associate professor at the University of Tromsø, the Arctic University of Norway. He also works as a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo. Maybe, Salihin, in the meantime, if you can, prepare your slides. Tromsø, he leads a project funded by the Norwegian Research Council, and it's titled Stateless in Bengali Borderlands: New Technologies and Challenges for Identity and Identification. Presently, Dr. Salihin is also a visiting researcher in the Refugee Studies Center of the University of Oxford, and his research expertise encompasses migration and refugees, with a particular emphasis on the new technologies in politics of integration, emergencies, refugee-led initiatives, and the gendered dimension of forced migration. His forthcoming book is titled Gendered Vulnerabilities in Forced Migration: Rohingya Refugees in Bangladesh, that will be published with Palgrave Macmillan very soon. So, Salihin, I'm very happy to have you here, and the floor is yours. I'm just gonna, thanks for reminding me. I will give to each speaker 10 minutes, so I would really appreciate if we will all honor the schedule to have lunch on time.
Thank you very much, Estella, my friend, introducing me. And as you said, my name is Salihin, and today I'm going to focus a little bit on my project and also on looking at one of the core ideas that we have been seeing over the last few years on the concept of localizing aid. So today I put my topic is, or the title of the topic is Humanitarian Aid, Dependency, Localization, and Resilience. I'm trying to look at how could we actually unpack the complexities in it. And my case will be definitely the Rohingyas living in Bangladesh. So I guess we all know about the Rohingyas, and it's been almost 6 years now, started in 2017 August, and we have now approximately 1 million registered Rohingyas living in Bangladesh. That was done by UNHCR and Bangladesh government. And you might be aware that Bangladesh size of the country, with, if you compare it with England, is only 1.1 times as big as England, and the population is approximately 160 million. So in addition to that population, you got like one, and some rough estimate shows that we have like more than 1 million, or sometimes it says it is 1.2 million Rohingyas living in Bangladesh. What is happening in the camp now is that these refugees are entirely dependent on the humanitarian aid, but as the keynote speech also mentioned, there is a continuous reduction in humanitarian aid, and that's why you see worldwide there was a reduction. And if we look at the Rohingya case, in 2022, 63% of appeal was met by the donors, and now in 2023, they are a little bit afraid of not meeting even 60% of the commitments or the proposal for the aid. And what is happening even was, over the last 3-4 months, WFO has been reducing the amount of food aid. So it was 3-4 months ago, it was $12. Then it was reduced to $10 in March, and now it's came to $8 a month each person. So why this reduction? And then how could we actually help this? So one of the ideas was that even if you look at the international communities, they have been emphasizing on let's make them resilient, or let's increase the self-dependency among these refugees. But how do you do it? So one of the ideas could be that maximize the effect of every pound that the international donors spend on it. But how? So I think, from my experience of working with these refugees in Bangladesh, I still think, despite of a lot of criticism about these ideas of localizing aid, because many research has been showing that there is a new liberal turn in it, and bypassing the state and strengthening these NGOs, there is a lot of there are some criticism about it. But I want to still stick to the grand bargains idea of like how could you actually increase the funding portion, like if not 25%, but at least increase a little bit, and also how we could strengthen the local actors. As you can see, the criticism of these ideas of local is really a bit problematic, because one core problem is that who are locals in this refugee or humanitarian aid governance. So I'll try to focus also on that one also. And that's why I put like my main objective was through this presentation is to see the complexity intervene this effective use of funding, self-dependence, and resilient refugees. What does this mean, and how do these three different components or three interconnected components interact? So in doing so, first I will focus on this. What are the factors that was leading to inefficiency in aid management, particularly this international flow of humanitarian aid? And then I try to look at what are the nature and extent of aid localization in the context of Rohingya refugees, and how does this local ownership actually unfold in complex emergencies. So as you can see from this, there are two parallel but connected management authorities in this refugee aid governance. One is Bangladesh government, and then the other one is international communities, and the lowest unit is UNO, who is the lowest tier of this local government, but still quite high in his position. And then there is NGOs, but of course under the umbrella of IOM, UN, and UNHCR. So usually I don't see any local, even the word there. And recently, as you can see, there are 34 partners in this humanitarian aid governance. And from 2023 report, I counted it would be around 50 organizations from NGOs from Bangladesh. But I was just trying to look at this report from 2023 to see who are these NGOs they included in. And most of the fund or the appeal came from the big NGOs like BRAC. So, and there are few small NGOs who are also part of this joint appeal, but not necessarily any local or very grassroots organization. Later on this, my main concern, these refugee-led organizations. So they don't even exist in their appeal system. So what was the big problem in, or some of the criticism of this aid management in this Rohingya crisis, particularly in the first phase, like from 2017, 18, 19, and until 20, then it got a little better. So one of the criticism was that there is so much overlapping and redundancy in resource distribution. For example, many of the NGOs, like international organizations, they have been actually doing same sort of work, and sometimes giving the same resources to same people. And some NGOs have been giving resources to, let's say, for example, when they included the host communities, those who live near the camp, they have been providing help to that people, not really going too far from the camp, who are also affected by this crisis, for example. And then there was also criticism even from the government and also from the local NGOs that there was a huge influx of foreign aid workers. For example, in 2018, there was around 3,000 foreign aid workers both registered and unregistered, in the camp. So in a small camp, 3,000 refugee aid worker, it created a lot of demand on the resources. For example, in that time, the price hike was like 400 times higher than usual price at this local level. So that has created a lot of issues in the local economy. And then there was huge issues of spending on transportation. For example, every day there was around 500 cars transporting in and out of the camps. That was a report from one local NGO. And Bangladeshi government has been really pointing, one of the minister's quote is there, foreign NGOs pays like 150 crore Bangladeshi taka for staff's hotel bill only. So these international staff residing in this 5-star, 4-star hotels in Cox's Bazar cost a lot of money. And there were some claims by some private, some NGOs and also from the government that the spending that was supposed to go to the Rohingyas, it was not that much, like only 25% of the funding they said or they claim. We cannot justify, I don't have enough data to justify their claim, but the claim was that only 25% of funding actually went to the refugees, and then this rest of the funding actually went to this management cost for this NGOs, like the international organizations. And then there is, of course, lack of information sharing and coordination between different agencies. Oh my God. So, but there are plenty of refugee-led organizations in the camp, and they are not, and they have been doing a lot of critical activities in the camp, but not necessarily getting any sort of help from or any funding from the camp. From the international organizations, and they said that they are the local. As I said, this is so complex because these refugee-led organizations, they claim themselves they are local. The NGOs who work in this area, they say they are locals, and the national NGOs, they also say they are also local as they are working in the local areas. And then there is also us versus them issues, and there is also who are formal organizations, who are informal organizations. So many of the international organizations, they say they cannot work with this organization because these are informal and not recognized by the government. And there is also restrictions from the government whom we can work with and whom you cannot. And also there is issues of security and surveillance. And there is, of course, a high risk of criminality and criminal activities in the camp. And that's why they think that they cannot work with the organizations. And funding is, again, an issue because there is a competition between different organizations, as I say. And that is how these RLOs or refugee-led organizations work with. They fund themselves from their own funding. And there is also informal flows of monies coming from, they say, from those of their relatives living in Malaysia, Indonesia, or in the Middle East. And of course, there is bureaucratic and legitimacy issues in this funding. And as I said, there was, of course, issues of militancy, and there is a fear of working with this organization because as one of the UNHCR employee was saying, some international organizations work with small groups based in the camps. Besides these groups, there are some other organizations in the camps that are radicalized. It is very challenging for the international organizations to know every detail of this radicalized organization. So you cannot be sure if you want to help this organization, whether they use the fund for their stated goals or something else. So that's what I call actually, there is a liquid fear among these international organizations. And there is, of course, some power balance issues. And these organizations are not really, I mean, there is inequality, of course, in terms of power relations. And one interesting thing, just this might be the last one. One of the organization, like is called RCMC in the camp. It's not organization, it's an initiatives. But one of the respondent was telling me that, this initiative, this Rohingya Cultural Memory Center, it was designed in the West, then produced in the camp. So this is still, they see that these are Western imperialism is still there. So not really helping the locals. So that's why I think it's really problematic to see how this localization work. And I think as I said, despite of all criticism, I think we still need to strengthen these local organizations and of course the refugee-led initiatives. Thank you very much.
I know how difficult it is to squeeze very important information in 10 minutes. So thanks for sharing your research, and for sure, like, we can get back to some of the concepts you raised in the Q&A. So by the way, I forgot to say that I'm gonna give 10 minutes to each speaker, and just at the end of all talks, we have a general Q&A with online, with our online audience as well. Thank you for that. Now I have the pleasure to introduce you to Shaheen Ashraf. Shaheen, here you are. Ms. Ashraf is head of Global Advocacy for Islamic Relief Worldwide and the local councillor in Solihull for the Green Party. Shaheen will discuss with us the politics of humanitarian aid, rethinking resource allocation, and prioritizing people in need. So she extensively worked on gender equality and climate justice in several countries, ranging from Indonesia to Pakistan in particular, and Nepal. So Shaheen, over to you.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's great to be here today, and thank you, Estelle, for convening the Humanitarian Summit, and to all your colleagues as well. I mean, I've just come back from last year. I came back from Afghanistan. I worked in the Pakistan situation, came back from Indonesia, and it's a dire crisis. I'm also the chair of ICFA, which is 150 plus members in over 160 countries based in Geneva. But before I attempt to tackle this topic, let us for a moment imagine, and it's what was mentioned earlier, protracted crisis lasting for 5+ years. In the future, what we're going to do is, as was mentioned earlier, it will be a cyclical cycle. Take Afghanistan, for example, since 1979. It's cyclical. You have it to 1998, 2001, and back to Afghanistan again, which has become, again, longer than a protracted crisis. With the growing number of political conversations and the lack of peace agreements, we're finding that more and more these crises are affecting us. We're seeing ODA shrinking, which is obviously development aid shrinking as well. And it is that geographical and historical shift that we're not seeing the same ODA going to the same countries over the same period of time and not shifting the narrative in that sense. One of the things I've just come back from is us as INGOs looking to the future. What does the future look like for us in a shrinking civil society space? So imagine if you're in the year 2030. Civil society is facing unprecedented challenges, but also opportunities. The world will face a polycrisis, simultaneous and overlapping crises, including armed conflicts and humanitarian crisis, deepening polarization in society, economic shocks, and an existential climate crisis on top of that. And steadily, the pushing back of regressive agendas. We've seen gender equality being pushed back 25 years, which has actually affected the work that we do in the countries that we operate in. But most of these trends are already here. But we, as was mentioned earlier, civil society will adapt, and we will reinvent, and we will continue to reinvent ourselves. So we've got AI, we've got social media in this current crisis. And we will still have the 1% who hold the power to decide what happens to the fate of people. Oh, I meant to turn the slide. You can tell I've done these slides because I haven't written much, but I'll talk a lot, but yeah. And it's important, and as was mentioned earlier, you know, it's imperative that we acknowledge and confront the key weaknesses and prevent that prevent action in addressing global crises. Over the past decade, there has been growing disillusionment within the aid sector. I mean, I've seen working firsthand with communities on the ground, like in Afghanistan. When I went to Afghanistan last year, I remember talking to women in a camp, and 3 of them said, "Can you just take my child? Because I am unable to cope in this situation. I am unable to have a business because my situation means that I cannot have a business," which also meant that the funding that we got was unable to be enacted in that space. And that's what it means, boils down to, ladies and gentlemen, it boils down to the average individual who in those countries needs our support. So the concern that we have is, how do you respond effectively? And why is this the case? The case revolves around the prioritization of short-term and emergency relief supplies. So for example, Islamic Relief will get funding 12 months, 24 months. That's not enough. That is not enough to change the social norms or the behaviors of a situation or to change the crisis in that space. All you're doing is putting a Band-Aid. And that's what's happening. All we're doing is putting the Band-Aid. And that traditionally goes back to how donors prioritize funding. And is going back to that historical context of what needs to shift. Actually, there does need to be a radical shift. Funding has to be 10 to 15 years plus in order for it to be effective in this space. And you mentioned earlier around the prioritization of initiatives and how we work, and same aid agencies are giving in the same place. One aid agency may get 12 months funding in that area, no reporting, well, there will be reporting. The other aid agency may get exactly the same funding from the same donor to do the same program. That's another 12 months, but it does not change the situation for the people. And so what you see is evident. The short-term emergency solutions, though necessary, are not sufficient on their own. The concern regarding the prioritization of short-term funding, for example, emergency is a vivid example. Now you have to consider the case of Haiti. For those of us who work, who've worked in this space, a country that has faced significant challenges over the years. It is the world's most, I can't even begin to say what, it's the worst humanitarian crisis that I've ever seen. You know, this is what happened. In the 1970s, Haiti's food exports constituted nearly half of its GDP, indicating a robust agricultural sector. However, natural disaster struck the country in the 2000s, wreaking havoc on its agricultural and plunging the population into a food crisis. During the humanitarian response, the focus primarily was on immediate relief, which is the humanitarian, including cheap food and imports as aid. While this approach addressed the immediate hunger needs for the people, it failed to address the underlying causes and the neglect of the long-term rebuilding of the agricultural sector. And as a result, Haiti became increasingly dependent on food imports, particularly rice, with 80% of its rice now being imported mainly from the United States. The short-sighted approach created a cycle of chronic food insecurity and dependency, with over 1.8 million Haitians currently facing critical levels of food insecurity by prioritizing these short-term emergency solutions without addressing the root causes of investing in long-term development. And that inadvertently has perpetuated suffering and dependency. Haiti's governance at the moment, 80% of that is run by armed groups and armed gangs. And if you look at the history of Haiti as an example, it is what we shouldn't be doing, and it is what we are doing, unfortunately. I think I've spoken about primary concerns. Spoken about that. So since you've given us 10 minutes, because I thought we had 15, it's fine. And it's essential to kind of break that cycle of dependency and invest in long-term solutions that enable communities to become self-sufficient. This means promoting initiatives that restore livelihoods, build infrastructure, and empower local community populations to become agents of change themselves. And this is what we're not seeing. By addressing the root causes of crisis and adopting a comprehensive approach that combines emergency relief with sustainable development, and we can pave the way for what I think and what I was mentioned, a kind of a more resilient future for aid agencies, for communities as well as the agencies that operate it. So just to sum up on this one, the prioritization of short-term and emergency relief, the tradition of humanitarian work is one which concerns itself primarily with treating the symptoms of a problem rather than its causes. Although many humanitarian organizations now also engage in development, the standard practice across the sector remains short-term, reactive approaches, which only addresses a problem once it becomes a crisis. As other panelists have mentioned, there's a growing reckoning within the sector that short-term emergency solutions, while necessary, are by no means sufficient on their own. And I've given the example of Haiti. And then the other thing that so if we're in 2030, the other thing that we need to think about is the accuracy of early warning systems and the systems that will need to be in place that contribute to anticipatory action, which would minimize both the suffering of the people and the funds that are needed in future to facilitate recovery. And we're not thinking like that at the moment. And that's what needs to be done. So you can tell I'm not a multitasker. So in what way? And the other thing I want to talk about, and we've spoken about it earlier, humanitarian financing. There's a massive gap in humanitarian financing, excuse me. I came off a flight, so just from Istanbul, so just bear with me. The other thing around humanitarian financing is you've got UN Security Council resolutions in Afghanistan, for example. And you as an aid agency are trying to channel your fundings into Afghanistan. You could do it through Russia at one time, but you can't do that anymore. You can't do it through Italian banks. So the humanitarian financing and the dependency around that has also become a problem, which is why we can't get money into the places that we need to. The other thing I also want to mention is, you mentioned it before around climate financing. We as aid agencies cannot get funding from the climate financing. Climate financing is all the way up there and is leveled in by the World Bank and the IMF, which will go to the Asian Development Bank for places like Bangladesh who can access it. But the governments can access it. We will not be able to access it for long-term recovery programming. And that's something that we need to advocate for, because in actuality, when you're talking about long-term sustainable solutions, those are the places that you need to access financing. Just to sum up, the first point and the most important point is the structure of funds. We know that there is significant financial shortage as donors. We also know that aid budgets are being cut. We also know that we are chronically underfunded. In addition to this, the structure of the most available funds is formulated in a way, and I think you mentioned it before, that prioritizes humanitarian efforts over development efforts. And some funds explicitly prohibit the use of funds for non-emergency purposes, whilst others, though allowing a broader agenda, function in a way that only allows for short-term projects or projects in practice. And the second point I want to make is that deserves to be touched is localization, and I think it's hyper-localization. That's a new word, that buzzword that's coming out, and allocation of funds across the sector. You know, local organizations are intimately connected to their communities and often are the first to respond to emergencies. And why shouldn't they get the funds before everybody else? And I'll give you the example of Syria. Some of the sanctions were lifted on Syria for us to get aid into Syria. But it does not mean that we can get funding into Syria for the crisis and the earthquake. And just something to think about, that the political dimensions really hamper us as INGOs. And then you've got the banking and the de-risking sector all coming at the same time. And what you've got is protracted crisis around the world. So we are stuck in this space, unfortunately, where we see opportunities, but we also see major challenges. You know, we are one of the largest faith-based organizations in the UK, and we recognize the responsibility to lead and influence on these agendas. We recognize that we have to lead and advocate on lots of these things. We are on a government group called the Tri-Sector Apartheid Group, which is a government initiative with banks, INGOs, and government. That situation will become worse because banks and government decide who gets funding to where it needs to go to. So that political dimension, it hasn't been mentioned at the moment, but just to mention that. And just to conclude on the path ahead is, if we return to the initial question around financial shortage versus the use of resources within the humanitarian sector, it is true that the allocation of resources across the sector is uneven and not always the most effective, particularly with regards to the slowness to localize. However, the existence of readily available multi-year funds must necessarily be the first step in treating any disease within the sector. This is particularly dangerous where we are at the moment as funding decrease and the lifeline of millions are cut. And I have witnessed that firsthand in Afghanistan. At a time when there is an unprecedented need and ever-growing frequency of extreme climate events caused by climate change, it must be unequivocally stated that investing less is not an option. And we need to do more now to ensure less suffering and less need in the future. So let's think about when we're visioning where we are as humanitarian needs increase, what we would do going back to what does 2030 look like for us. But thank you. Okay.
Okay, great. Green light. Thanks, Charlie, for your very thought-provoking presentation and for raising the importance of time as a critical factor in humanitarian action. So now we turn to Dr. Rosanna Himas. I'm very happy to introduce you to my colleague. She also teaches on the Bachelor of Science in Global Humanitarian Studies that our head of department, Professor Walker, mentioned this morning in her opening. So Dr. Himas is an associate professor in humanitarian economics at IRDR UCL. Her research areas include policy impact evaluation, child welfare, and risk and disaster reduction. She's worked on Ethiopia, India, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the UK. Before joining UCL, Rosanna also worked as a researcher in the Department for International Development at the University of Oxford, and she was also a consultant for the World Bank and the International Labour Organization. So Dr. Himas' key question today is how exactly can we measure if we've done more or done less? So her talk will discuss data problems, and access problems and targeting issues without knowing who gets what within a household and within a community. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Rosanna's presentation, and the floor is yours. Not sure if you want to.
Hi, everybody. So I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you, Estella, for inviting. So what I want to talk about is how exactly we can measure if we've done more or done less. And my presentation will focus on two key elements. So I'm an academic, unlike the other speakers who had a more sort of on-the-ground experience. So in terms of how exactly can we measure if we've done more or done less, I'll be looking very briefly at evaluating what we've done, the importance of evaluation, and where we are in terms of actually evaluating how well we've done. And the second point pertains to targeting, and that's whether as an organization that's intervening, as a government, as an NGO, an INGO, just taking a step back and thinking of, are we actually doing the right thing? And the right thing in terms of, are we targeting the right issues? Are we targeting the right people or the communities or the subgroups? So let me talk first about the evaluation aspect. Now, evaluation, humanitarian evaluation can take various forms. So this can be evaluating coverage, evaluating efficiency of your program, achievement, expected and unexpected events that occur. It can be monitoring and evaluation, so evaluating performance against the targets that you've set. All this comprises evaluation, but I'm focusing on a particular type of evaluation that is really, really sparse, empirical evaluation that is incredibly sparse. And this evaluation is about actually evaluating the impact of your intervention on the outcomes of people. So say, for example, you take what Salehem was talking earlier in a Rohingya refugee camp, you have so many interventions, but what exactly does, say, a food-based intervention targeting children, what exactly was the impact of that on improving children's weight for height, for example? Or you have other types of interventions, say, programs that help entrepreneurship, so that you want to break the dependency cycle. How did that, what actually was the impact of that on improving employment or improving wages in this context? Now, the thing is, there are, in terms of really rigorous studies, I think I can sort of count the number of rigorous studies that might have been done, empirical studies that have been done in this context, and it's under a dozen. It's under a dozen. So we're talking about rigorous impact evaluation that can sort of unpick when there's a context where there are multiple programs happening, everyone is working on things, how exactly do you know that it is your intervention that is causing that change? So rigorous impact evaluation is really sparse. So this is an area that has to improve if you want to exactly measure if you've done more or done less. And of course, impact evaluation in emergency situations is incredibly difficult. One of the reasons is because the gold standard for impact evaluation is to is randomized controlled trials or setting up an experiment. And you can imagine how hard that is to do in a crisis situation. How can you say, look, I'm only targeting this group of children to give my free milk and not this group when everyone is in need. So it's quite difficult to do this, but it has been done. And it can be done. And this is an area that needs to improve if you want to evaluate whether we are actually spending these resources the way or whether we can actually improve the way we spend it. Okay, so much for impact evaluation. The next point I want to look at is about targeting. So this is actually taking a step back, noticing that there are all these needs, but are we actually targeting the most pertinent need? Do we actually know what's happening on the ground? And again, often when there's an emergency, what happens is there's a needs assessment, and you look at what sectors require the most, or the needs of the various sectors. So let's take, for example, the education sector. You would have all these needs, and the education sector would then be appraised, and a needs assessment would probably say, yes, this percentage of the loss and damage goes to the education sector. So let me give you an example, right? Example from the case of Malawi. So in 2015-2016, Malawi was affected with a really severe drought, and there was a state of disaster declared in May 2016. So in terms of damages, over a 6-month period, the damages were estimated to be 36.6 million. And of that, the education sector was assessed to comprise 9% of those damages. So the damages for the education sector was 9% of that. And the losses were about 5% of the total losses estimated in the needs assessment. Now, when they do, and then of course you had the severe flooding in 2019 in Malawi. And again, you had losses and damages estimated, and the education sector had, about 20% in terms of damages and 0.8% in terms of losses. Now, when the World Bank and the UNICEF and the Malawian government estimate these losses and damages, often these needs assessments are based on loss or damage to infrastructure or crops. So for the education sector, for example, that 9% came from looking at non-functional water taps and boreholes and wells in schools. The 5% loss came from the losses incurred in terms of student school meals due to crop loss in school gardens. So the losses and damages to the education sector, quite rightly for various reasons, is measured based on the losses and damages to infrastructure or crops. But then, if you really think of a severe drought or a severe flood, you notice that the way a drought or a flood affects education is through impacts beyond just the damage to infrastructure, right? So a severe drought, for example, could have impacts or has impacts directly on health, on children's health, on the health of teachers. It has an impact on household incomes. It has an impact on intra-household bargaining and bargaining power and conflict within households. It has an impact on the local economy. And this means that job opportunities for young people could be reduced, which means what we call as economists the opportunity cost of going to school might be actually lower because you don't have job opportunities, you'd rather go to school. So all these things happen that have an impact on education. And it has an impact not just on short-term education, but for those who are affected, the effects can be persistent and can be long-term. It can affect, for example, a shock to your human capital accumulation. So your shock to your schooling, for example, that happens during primary school age. If you drop out because of the drought, that can have lasting impacts on your productivity, your wages 20 years later. It can have intergenerational consequences as well. So not only, and that should perpetuating or creating a new cycle of poverty, a new cycle of crisis with your children affected as well. Now, the interesting thing, though, and rather sad thing, is that in terms of empirical evidence, very, very, very little work has been done on actually estimating the effect of droughts and floods and this type of extreme weather events on these, on household behavior, on within household resource allocation. And that hasn't been done. So one of my colleagues at the IRDR, Shams, I know Shams, Shams and we wanted to look at how droughts and floods and this type of extreme weather events can actually impact household behavior and change how resources are allocated within a household. So we looked at Malawi, we used data from 2010 to 2019, and we had a sample size of about like 8,000 children. And the really interesting thing about the data set was that you find, this was a panel data set, so you find the same child followed throughout that 9-year period. You find information on individual level education expenditure and enrollment. And this really allows you to capture with some difficulty. There are problems with this type of estimation that you have to deal with, econometric problems, but you can glean some insights about the impact the drought has on within household resource allocation. Resources in terms of time. So is a child actually going to school? And is there a difference between boys and girls in terms of schooling because of, during drought times? And then also in terms of the budget share of education, the share of education spending that you spend. And just to highlight here that I've got 1 minute left. So let me highlight here the importance of the type of work that we do at the IRDR, which is interdisciplinary work. And for big global challenges like this, you cannot just not have a team that has skills that come from various cases. Okay, I'll go very quickly to the key results of what we noticed about Malawi. So in normal times, you find that primary school, in terms of primary school enrollments between boys and girls, there isn't a statistically significant difference, right, in normal times. And this is for children aged about 5 to 14. That's Malawi's primary school is 8 years long. But then you notice that when you experience a drought in the short run, that actually increases boys' schooling, right? School enrollment. And that makes sense compared to girls. That makes sense because the opportunity cost, I said before, of schooling is lower because the opportunities outside are less. But most importantly, that's the short run effect. But if you look at the longer term, if you look at like 2 years after experiencing a drought, the drought, you notice, has a significant negative impact on boys' schooling and the budget share of education spending that parents do within a household on boys' spending. So we talk a lot of gender issues during crisis, but it's very important, I think, to make use of research, make use of existing secondary data, and make use of different types of data, administrative data, satellite data, remote sensing data. You can use this information to unpack patterns, to understand more about how behavior changes as a result of extreme weather events. And as a result, hopefully target better and be able to evaluate impact overall better. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rosanna. It was like definitely further food for all. Sorry, yeah, so like further food for thought on resource allocation. Thanks a lot, Rosanna, for this. Now we will turn to Anne Harmer. I have the pleasure to introduce you to her, and she's been working as a head of research for health in a humanitarian crisis at ERA since 2015. Anne brought to her role a commitment to using evidence to improve humanitarian response. So prior to that, she worked for many years with NGOs, the United Nations, the European Commission, supporting the implementation of sexual and reproductive health and rights programs in Southeast Asia in particular, including crisis-affected settings. So Anne's contribution today will discuss how to increase the evidence base, maximize resources for an effective humanitarian response. So I'm very glad to have you here, Anne. Over to you.
Thanks, Estella. I don't have slides, unlike all of my predecessors, so I'm just going to speak from my notes. Is the mic here? Yeah, I think so. Can everybody hear? Yeah, great. Thank you. As Estella mentioned, I work for ELRA, which you may or may not have heard of. It's an NGO that finds solutions to complex humanitarian crises through research and innovation. And we work in partnership with humanitarian organizations, academics, innovators and the private sectors to address some of the most challenging problems in humanitarian settings. And we fund research and innovation, but we also work to promote the uptake of new evidence and new solutions with the users of evidence, i.e. funders, practitioners, and so on. So that's the work that ELRA does. And what I'm here really to talk about today is to talk specifically about some of the work that I'm involved with, which is the research for help in humanitarian crisis. I'm not going to talk specifically to that, but actually to the need to improve the evidence base, because I believe that by improving the evidence base on which humanitarian response is evidenced, we can actually do more with less. So I'm also going to talk a little bit about some recently funded research where I'll be highlighting the need for a coordinated approach within the humanitarian ecosystem to oversee the research investments and establish a system for a more equitable approach to identify research priorities, which actually is very kind of complementary to what Claudia's talked about. It's like digging deeper into one quite small niche area. So very complementary. As everybody this morning has already talked about, we know that there is a much greater demand for humanitarian assistance than there are resources. And OCHA estimated at the end of 2022 that 339 million people will need humanitarian assistance and protection this year. But we already heard from Joanna that currently it's 404 million. So we can see that there's a huge increase in numbers. And we know there's a significant gap between pledged resources and actual need, and inadequate resources to support the many people currently affected by crises around the globe. So if we look at what OCHA was kind of basing their estimates of numbers of people at the end of last year, they were looking for resources for all the known existing and protracted crises that are taking place. Say, for example, the crisis in Ukraine, the long-going critical food security situation in the Horn of Africa. So that was known, but then there was also unknown. Even this year, there are new humanitarian crises such as the earthquake in Turkey and northern Syria, such as the very recent, political conflict and situation in Sudan. So the whole time there's this escalation of humanitarian crises. In this context, it's critical for funders of humanitarian response, i.e. the donors to which we're looking to support the work that's being done by humanitarians, and those delivering humanitarian aid in its various forms, to know whether existing programs and interventions are effective and provide the best value for money. We can't afford to waste limited resources on policies and programs that don't work, and timely and prioritized research can provide an evidence base on which resource allocations can actually be made. We know that research contributes to improved humanitarian response, and I'm going to give just two examples of very, very well evidenced interventions. So the first of those is, for a long time, it was believed that severe acute malnutrition among children needed specialized treatment in inpatient facilities, which was expensive and a burden on health systems and also on patients' families. And then in the mid-1990s, ready-to-use therapeutic food was developed. And then in 2000, a new approach began to be tested through research, which involved the community management of acute malnutrition, or commonly called CMAM. And that research quickly demonstrated the effectiveness of that approach. And since 2007, CMAM has been the accepted standard of care and practice in humanitarian settings. This is a prime example of how research has changed and shifted and made more economical the approach. Another example, which again is something that Claudia touched on, is the evolution of knowledge through research of the effectiveness of cash and voucher assistance as an alternative to food and commodity distribution, which previously was the preferred response. So cash and voucher assistance allows people to take their own decisions, to make their own priorities, and also helps boost local economies. And the amount of budget that's gone on that has increased from 2.8 billion in 2016 to nearly 8 billion that Claudia mentioned just last year. So that's an exponential growth in aid that's actually it's come about because of research testing a new intervention as well. So it's not just carried out, it's then tested. And even as we speak, there's more research that's taking place to look at the impacts on health of various cash and voucher assistance transfers. So there's more research underway even as we go to better refine the response. So recognizing that promotion and uptake of evidence generated through research can help funders and humanitarian organizations to make informed choices on the most effective interventions, it's critical for research to be adequately funded and recognized as an essential contribution. So while the funding envelope might need to be different from humanitarian response, the two are actually critically linked and need to be better connected and coordinated. And it might surprise you to know that no mechanism currently exists for tracking research financial investments in the humanitarian system, and that major major data gaps prevent the development of a robust global overview of such spending. We recently commissioned research through a global prioritization exercise to understand investment trends and activities in humanitarian research and innovation. And in essence, as I say, this was sort of like a deep dive into one of the very small areas of work that's covered through humanitarian assistance. So it's much deeper in one very small area that Claudia was talking about, which was in relation to the overall funding for humanitarian response. So analysis on funding flows identified that research in the humanitarian system is funded through two main streams. The first stream consists of allocations from within the humanitarian assistance budgets, where most funders are government donors in high-income countries. And the data sources that we looked at were IRDR and then the OECD Common Reporting Standards and OCHA Financial Tracking Services. And what we were able to identify from the very poor data sources, which others have mentioned, is that approximately 0.2% of the overall humanitarian assistance budget is spent through direct allocations, reported allocations on research, which is a tiny proportion of funding when compared to the overall humanitarian response budget. And then the second stream of funding includes ODA that comes from outside of the humanitarian system and also from private sector and non-traditional actors, including academic, philanthropic, and private sector sources of funding. And the analysis showed that actually the volume of funding coming from outside the traditional humanitarian system is much bigger than that coming from within the humanitarian assistance budgets, with ODA from around 50 donors comprising about 3 million, and some other 26 funders contributing $231 million. However, there's no system in place for measuring such resource flows, knowing what research is being funded, or for measuring the outcomes. Our analysis also found that most of the research funding was both provided and received by actors in high-income countries, with only a very, very small amount allocated to the actors in the countries affected by crises, which again reflects what we've been talking about and the lack of progress towards the commitments on the localization agenda, which confirms what we already know, which is that institutions based in high-income countries continue to hold most of the leadership and decision-making roles in relation to resource allocation, including for research. So to realize the full potential of research to support humanitarian action, the ability to coordinate efforts and align resources around the most pressing issues is imperative. But this can't be achieved without clear visibility of who is investing in what and where and when. Moving on from the funding flows analysis, we've also funded some regional and national consultations to understand how problems and gaps related to research in the humanitarian ecosystem are identified, along with barriers and gaps in the system. And preliminary findings from that research show that some humanitarian crises receive more research and attention than other crises of similar devastation and magnitude, meaning that, in other words, the level of research attention isn't always proportionate to the magnitude of the humanitarian crisis in question. this was reflected, I think, very clearly in what Claudia was saying when she showed some of the flags and who's funding what and where. Because donor decisions tend to be influenced by foreign policy considerations, the geographical location of a crisis and proximity bias, geopolitical, economic and trading interests, and the political impact of stability of the crisis-affected setting. So we can see that there are these major influences, and everybody's calling for a change in the system, but it's so critical, really, if we want to be more effective in how spend is. So in conclusion, I'd like to present the case that by ensuring that the humanitarian interventions we fund are evidence-based, i.e. known to be effective and to provide the best options for the largest number of people affected by crises, investment in research and its uptake is a way of ensuring that we can maximize the use of available resources and thus do more with less. Right now, there is no mechanism in place for us to know or track what funding is allocated for research, whether from within humanitarian assistance or from other sources. Nor do we know how decisions are made on research priorities, what people are doing the research on. So to ensure that we're able to do more with less, there are three key things that I believe require immediate attention. Firstly, we need to bring funders outside of the humanitarian system into the research and innovation ecosystem and to build stronger relationships with them. Secondly, more work and commitment is needed to shift priority setting, decision-making and funding allocations to those who are closest to where humanitarian needs are experienced. And last but not least, we need to improve the way the humanitarian system reports its spending on research and innovation by creating better frameworks. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Anne. Like further insights and like thanks for mapping out the general tendency of how funding is provided and why there is absolutely paramount in what we research and what we work on in general. So at this point, I would invite all speakers to the table, please, so that you can actually come back here. I would say, I mean, we don't have much time. We're already running over time, actually. But I would say maybe like a 10, 15 minute Q&A. So let's collect a few questions from the audience. And of course, I would coordinate with you, Callum, for our online audience. Yeah. So any burning questions for Anne, Shaheen, Rosanna, and Mohammed? Yes, please.
So clearly from the conversations that have been had this morning, donors are an incredibly important part of the humanitarian system. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how we start influencing and educating donors to move towards things like long-term funding, funding more evidence-based interventions, because it sounds like at the moment that's one of the key sticking points.
Anyone else? Hi, I have a question for Shaheen Ashraf. You mentioned that the nature of current humanitarian financing doesn't allow for longer term solutions and it only allows for a short-term emergency response. But I was wondering, isn't that precisely the definition of humanitarian response? It's supposed to provide immediate relief to human suffering, whereas tackling root causes is left for more political actors. So are you then advocating for a more expanded definition of humanitarianism? And I think you mentioned things like building institutions and infrastructure, but wouldn't that be stretching the meaning of humanitarianism a bit too much? Thank you.
Sorry, thanks. Just building on the last question, I think we're looking at a few sectors that have some really embedded stakeholders, and it can be quite difficult to turn a big ship. So, you know, building on that question and thinking about the siloization of how programs are done, picking up on the earlier speaker who's talking about the nexus, how can we do better coordinated programming and funding across the nexus and across the cycles of crisis in order to kind of meet the needs that all of you have spoken about. And just also just a great, just thanks, Anne, for like making our point. It's really fantastic about data.
I think there was like a fourth question down there. Yeah, so we can get, is there anyone online?
Thank you. Yeah, and a question on localization has been something that's been coming up in all of the discussions. And I'm interested particularly in the example in Cox's Bazar of refugee-led organizations and around legitimacy of how it's decided who would be a legitimate local actor.
Excellent. So I think we can start. Yeah, yes, please. Yeah, these 4 questions first.
Okay, thank you so much. In terms of legitimacy issues, particularly in Bangladesh, for example, there is a regulation from the government who is considered to be an NGO. So if the refugees consider themselves an organization, they need to be registered with the NGO Affairs Bureau, or if not, they need to be registered with the Department of Social Welfare. But since the refugees are not recognized as a refugee in Bangladesh, they are recognized Myanmar nationals, so they are not entitled to get any organization registered in the system. So since they are not registered, so nobody can actually help them formally, so they are helping informally. So it's the Bangladesh government who decides who is who, if you have the right or if you are legitimate to operate in the refugee context. Thank you.
Question was for you, the second one.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I mean, I think humanitarian organizations have dual mandates. We operate as a humanitarian organization as well as a development agency as well. So I think it's important. Yes, we do tackle the immediate relief, and that happens in the immediate crisis. So we have 1 to 3 year programming around humanitarian. And then if we are in the country longer, we do have development programming that has to shift the kind of conversation around the humanitarian architecture and financing in order to build sustainable communities. And if you look at just the SDGs, I mean, if you're going to tackle gender equality, but don't tackle SDG 5 and SDG 4 together, as well as SDG 1 together, you need them to be building blocks to each other. So you would need long-term financing that is part of the development access that will help you with humanitarian efforts, because no crisis lasts. On average, according to the crisis group, every potential crisis will now last longer than 10 to 15 years.
The third question from the lady there, I think it was addressed to Anne primarily, right? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to start on the question about how do we, convince donors and funders. And I think one of the things is that there is a massive gap between the availability of new evidence and making that accessible to those who need the information. So when we look at funders, I think the argument is fairly clear. If we conduct impact evaluations and we're able to say, this works, this doesn't, this is more cost effective than that, this is fairly clear. But where there's this massive gap is between the kind of research and the development of evidence base, and then the getting that in clear, easy, accessible formats to those who need them, and to actually making a case and a convincing argument to donors and funders of humanitarian response. And also, I think that there's a huge need for them to coordinate amongst themselves and to understand and to commit that if there is evidence-based practice, let's fund that, not just random things that organizations want to do because they've always done that. And there is so much, you often see there's this resistance within humanitarian organizations because we've always done it like this, therefore we will continue. But actually there are better solutions. So I think when donors and funders of humanitarian response know that or have been informed because they receive the information in accessible formats, I think then it's imperative for them to take action and say, well, we will only fund these kinds of solutions. And so for me, that's one of the routes forward, but the whole thing is so complex. That's perhaps just one area.
Can I just add to Anne's response? So I quite agree with Anne that in terms of influencing, it's really important that you have that solid evidence base and it's communicated in a way that practitioners understand. There is another element as well, I think. So I strongly feel that a lot of the work that we do here in London, the discussions we have in, say, Washington, DC, and all these places might not, most often do not reflect what people on the ground actually need or what their priorities are. So I think we have to be very, very mindful of that as well, when we're trying to advocate and influence that. What we come up with might not actually be what we want or what's in the best interest.
I think can I add to that as well? I guess I agree with what everybody said, and I guess the need for that's not working. I'm so sorry. That's what I was trying to say. Do we have to wait? Oh, okay, no, it's fine. No, I mean, I think we're all in agreement on this issue, and I do believe that the humanitarian architecture does need to change to reflect the communities that we work with. The one thing I've heard from the civil society space, just came back from Berlin, and we're trying to do this horizon scanning on where we will be in 2030. And one of the conversations was around actually, what does a power shift look like? So if you are saying it is the Western donors that are giving, what does it mean to shift their narrative to a decolonized stroke, that lens to be able to shift the narrative around the communities it serves? So we talk about localization, but each NGO will have its own understanding of localization, but still wants to hold the pot of funding from a donor. So there is a great need to have a bigger conversation, and I think that will be your next year's conference probably.
Can I just add one? Of course.
Yeah.
So in addition to that, from one of my experiences in Rohingya refugee camp, how donors actually select their case, like how targeted cases are sometimes neglected. For example, my experience with the gender-based violence, particularly most of the NGOs, when they are working, even the international donors, they're working with the gender-based violence against women. But there are plenty of men who has been raped, like sexually, for example, a victim of sexual violence during the crisis in Myanmar. Even the NGOs, some of them didn't, because it's such a kind of issues that nobody want to talk about it. And that's why even the organizations, they don't want to talk about it because, it's so sensitive. So I think humanitarian organizations, they also need to get out of this, if this is sensitive, they need to find a way how to deal with it, not really leaving it aside.
And please, if you want to link up your thoughts with the last question we had received, and also there are some people. Sorry, okay. Excellent. Yeah, just a second. I mean, just to respond to the last question, and then we get like the last two, I would say. Yeah, no time. Yeah. Okay, so let's get Lisa's question, my colleague here. Yeah.
I have a question mainly for Rosanna and Anne, so thanks for the excellent presentations. So my question is, given what we've heard, how can we better integrate evidence into humanitarian crises? Because you've mentioned that sometimes we're not looking at the right research priorities. So how do we deal with like emerging research priorities that need to be addressed? And, how can we work better with like local agencies?
My question is also to Rosanna. When it comes to research, I think, is the research very new when it comes to humanitarian crisis? For example, in countries like Pakistan, I think research is somewhere else and the humanitarian crisis is on another planet.
So in the interest of time, let me just give a summary answer to both the questions. How do we actually collect this evidence? How do we actually do the research? Is the research new? Well, I might be biased, but I'm not. I think the only way to handle the issues that you're addressing is through institutions like the IRDR, through doing interdisciplinary, rigorous research that actually involves not just one sort of a unifocus, but multiple focus, and as well as integrating with people on the ground. I think that is the only way in which we can actually get a better understanding, a more insightful, a more useful understanding of how to gather the data, get the data, what techniques to use, what types of data sources to use to actually tackle the problem. And yes, the research is it's new, I think also because it's just so difficult. It's just so difficult to evaluate impact without data from an empirical sense. So a lot of work has been done, I think, from a qualitative perspective, but they answer a different type of question. Thank you.
Anyone wants to add the last comment? Yeah, of course.
Thank you. I mean, we did a piece of research work last year for COP26 in Glasgow around climate-induced migration on the governance system of Pakistan and its responses to earthquakes and floods. And it was a narrative around what happens when climate refugees who are coming in from the coastal areas into urban areas. One of the things I do want to shift, and I know you're all talking about research, is that Pakistan has universities. We need to change our mindset to understand that those universities can help us to bring this data here. And often it is the Oxfords and the Cambridges that you want to conduct the research, and therefore it's still from a northern lens. I would like to bring that southern lens to this space to be able to understand that in actuality, University of Balochistan, Sindh, KPK were the ones that produced the research, which then led on to some great changes around the governance system of Pakistan's government on changing language around climate refugees. So it's really important that we bring that to the table as well and not just have the language the other way around. Thank you.
Yeah, sort of building on what Shaheen's saying, and the question really about, is this new? The program that I manage, which focuses on public health research and humanitarian crises, has been going for 10 years, and we've funded more than 100 studies looking at many different aspects of public health research. And all of them are using very rigorous methodologies. Probably a third of them are using RCTs. And all the research that we fund now has to be in collaboration with a local institution, a local research institution in the country where the study is taking place. And increasingly, more of those organizations are becoming the lead researchers, and they're engaging with northern academic institutions as partners rather than the other way around. Although there is still a preponderance, but there is a recognition that actually both bring value to research. So I completely agree with what Shaheen is saying, and it's a journey in progress. And then speaking to the other question around, how can we do better? I mean, what we're seeking to do in ULRA is actually to work with key funders, with OCHAs and others to actually try to establish a global framework that looks at research in humanitarian settings, research and innovation, so that we can understand better what the financial flows are and who's donating what, but also to understand what the research priorities are from the bottom up, so that the priorities are not just decided in the north, in the global north and by funders, but actually trying to determine a way that we can get those ideas and the needs from in country people affected by crises. It's actually very challenging because when we think about who people affected by crises are, and their needs are often different from other needs that might be, for example, in the field of public health, there might be a need for a better kind of vaccines, for example. And that may not necessarily speak to a need for somebody who actually just needs clean water, for example. So it's quite challenging, I think, to be able to understand, to be able to get inputs. But this is where working with local organizations and who are representative of different groups of affected people and academic institutions play a critical role in really helping us to identify what the research agenda is. And that's what we're trying to, through ELRA, we're trying to actually support the establishment of a mechanism that enables this to happen. So it's not just happening randomly, as currently is the case, but actually is organized and coordinated. It's a long journey to establish any kind of mechanism, a globally recognized mechanism, but we're starting to do that through this work, research that we've been doing over the past 5 years.
So thanks to all of you for your important comments, for sharing your research, your work with us, and thanks to you for attending. I'm afraid we really need to wrap up now, although like it was such an insightful discussion. We will see you here at 15 to 2, right? Yeah, it's 1:45. So after the lunch break, if you want any suggestion on where to have food, of course, do come to me, and I do have a few. Thank you. Thanks. I see you later.